This is Office Hours.
The show for sharing experiences and stories in governance, risk management, and compliance.
Today, we're going to discuss whether you're working with dead people or not.
Sounds intimidating.
In actual fact, that's not. We're going to kind of show you how you can maybe figure that out. But really what we're going to talk about today is identity theft. In particular, we're going to talk about a term called ghosting. Dan, have you heard the term in relation to identity theft? Have you heard of ghosting before?
Actually, primarily where I've heard the term ghosting or ghost is more around like ghost employee, ghost vendor, a employee that doesn't actually exist or a vendor that doesn't actually exist.
Right. So the term ghosting in relation to identity theft, I was doing a little bit of research on the topic last night, refers to when somebody falsely assumes someone else's identity and that person's identity who they're assuming is deceased. So they're called the ghost, and the person who's assuming their identity is the ghoster.
It's really funny. I actually had no idea that was the case. That's where that came from until you told me about 15 minutes ago.
Yeah.
That makes much more sense why ghost employees are in fact ghosts, if a bit morbid.
Right. A little bit morbid. So today we're going to talk about identity theft, and I had a really interesting experience where I worked with a really large retail company. We did a really simple test that I'm actually going to show you a little bit later. We'll give you some other examples, but essentially what we did is we matched some information from known deceased people in the United States with their employees' personal information, ended up finding more than 5 matches, and even one of the people was a high-level senior executive in the company. I don't know the exact details of the follow-up. They weren't able to share that, but I do know that when all the employees resigned immediately after being approached, so they were obviously hiding something.
So it's really interesting. So you presume this isn't a big problem, typically, but let's assume for a minute that large company probably has tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of employees. I don't even know which company you're talking about. But you only found 5 out of that huge population. Yet here we have a senior executive. Depending on the role and responsibility of that senior executive, how potentially damaging, I mean, that's not a question to be answered. That's a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
But that's enormously potentially damaging, especially should they have access to customer data, should they be making fraud-oriented decisions, because presumably this is a senior exec that didn't have an appropriate background check.
Yeah, well, they had a background check, but it wasn't for their background. It was for someone else's.
Right.
So I think we could assume that they were trying to hide something from their actual identity or from their actual background.
So given checking this is actually easy to do, you're going to show it. I mean, relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
Is this not worth the investment of an hour of time to make sure you're not employing a bunch of dead people who are in fact ghosts, people collecting a paycheck that don't work at...
Yeah.
I'm the payroll administrator and I set up 3 ghosts so that I get paid 4 times. Or even worse, the case like you had with this executive.
Yeah, no matter what industry you're in or what type of company you are, you're taking on a lot of risk if you could potentially have people working for you under a false identity, hiding backgrounds that they don't want you to know about. So that's a really simple example. I know, Dan, you had some really interesting experiences when it came to identity theft. Want to share those?
Well, and it really is identity theft, but I think the perpetrators don't even think about it that way. In my case, right. I spent a bunch of time consulting for one of the state governments in the U.S. In that particular scenario, what they did was all of the different agencies throughout the state that provided different benefits. So think administer different benefits like food stamps, like VA benefits, Medicaid, whatever the case may be, unemployment insurance. They centralized all of those payments through one benefits management system, which is good from an efficiency perspective and seeing all this data in one place, but makes it super complicated to keep track of. Keep in mind, each of those different types of benefits is legislated in a different way. And so the payments by law have to be managed in a different way. And it creates this massive complexity on a completely custom built system to be able to execute and sell these payments or execute and pay these payments. And so when that's happening, it creates this monstrous project with the typical sorts of delays and problems that you might expect in a program that big. And what happens is controls and governance are the first thing to take a back seat because my aging mother needs a Medicaid payment to be able to go to the doctor.
Right.
So we're just trying to get payments out the door, and then errors and fraud begins to happen. So in our case, that was a long-winded way of saying we looked at all of those different beneficiaries across all the different types of benefit payments the state made, and looked for amongst what we looked for was dead people. It's just such an obvious and easy place to start to say, almost consider it a risk assessment test. Like, hey, this is the simplest thing: is don't give food stamps to people who are already dead.
Yeah.
If we check for that and we find problems there's probably a whole bunch of other things we need to be looking at that could be causing inappropriate benefit payments. And punchline of the story is in our case, across different types of benefits, we found in the several hundreds of beneficiaries who were receiving payments that were in fact dead.
Yeah, so that's a good segue into, why would people steal another person's identity? In this case, they were wanting to defraud taxpayers,
right,
to skim a little bit of money, whether it be food stamps or Medicare payments or something else. And how ghosting usually comes up is people will troll or peruse the obituaries or online for when people are deceased. Their families are going through grieving periods and worrying about their loved ones and not maybe paying attention to financial stuff. And it may take a while for government agencies to share information that this person is deceased. So people will troll these obituaries. They'll then mine to try to get their personal information. They'll use it to get some of the examples you were talking about, open up fraudulent credit cards or a myriad of number of other things. Because usually from the research I did, it usually takes 3 to 6 months or longer for essentially that data to be shared across different systems and for you to not be able to open up a credit card as with a deceased person's social security number.
And if none of that, perhaps I was convicted of some kind of minor fraud when I was 26 years old. But as a 40-year-old executive, it still prevents me from getting certain jobs where there may be, industries where there's fraud. Can't get a job in financial services because of fraud risk involved.
Right.
So it's just simply to cover up my background.
Yeah, and not only that, you steal the person's experience and they're around the same age and they look kind of the same.
Right.
You now have maybe you went from someone who had experience in restaurants to all of a sudden, it looks like you could run the financial section of a
I'll tell you
company.
a story on a different day about another organization that I consulted for that fired a C-suite level executive because his education was false. Now, I'm not the kind of person who's big on thinking what university you went to really matters, but in financial services, where it's a part of how you get licensed and you lied,
right,
a real problem.
Yeah, in that case, we could sit here and debate credentials and stuff like that, but
right.
Just the sheer fact that you had to lie to get the job maybe isn't the type of person that you want managing the finances of the
right.
company. So next topic, and I think this should be fairly obvious by now, is why should anybody care about this? You're assuming, I think, if you're not checking for this as the really quick, easy win, then you could be assuming a lot of risk in your business. Look back at the example, senior executive making big decisions for a company, maybe even strategic decisions, or maybe they're using it as an avenue to actually create a bigger fraud within the company. Any of those and probably a lot of other examples are possible. So we can show you a really practical example today of how you can do a simple test You can get started on seeing if maybe something like this is happening in your organization or with your customers or with your employees, and then essentially take it from there and maybe we'll give some examples at the end on some more sophisticated testing you can do. So let's jump right into what you can do to prevent it. Actually, before I go in, I'll talk a little bit about, we're going to post, you'll see, we'll do some screen magic. You'll see a website where you can get what the federal government calls the Deaf Master List. And you can subscribe to this if you prove that you're going to be using it for fraud purposes or to try to detect fraud in your organization. They'll let you subscribe to this list. It gives you social security numbers and some other information about deceased people all the way back to, I believe, the late 1800s or early 1900s. So you get a lot of information there.
So fundamentally, how you prevent it is you take some third-party data source, like the Death Master List from the federal government, and use that to reconcile against your own internal data to identify these issues like you ran into at the retail company.
Yeah, essentially the data is available there for you out externally to be able to find out, here are all the people in the United States who have died in the last 100 years.
It's a simple example. There's lots of other kinds of third-party data that might be equally interesting.
Yeah, and then get access to your employee master file that has similar types of data, name, social security number, birth date, etc. And then just do some simple matching between the two and see if you find anything interesting.
Show us the magic.
So I'm going to go over to ACL Analytics, where I'm going to show just a simple join between those two different data sets so we can see if we find something interesting. You could use whatever your favorite analytics tool is to do similar types of matching. So over here on the left, you can see I have two different tables. I have our Deaf Master List that I acquired from the federal government agency, and I have our employee master file. This is actually sample data, not real data. This is not the ACL employee master file where we're going to be finding suspicious people, but just wanted to use it for demonstration purposes. And actually, when I created this sample data, I just used like a sample data generator on the web. It actually created our social security number with 9 digits, but it has a couple dashes in there. So I just did a really simple computed field, use the exclude command to just remove the dashes. Because if you look back at our Deaf Master List, you can see here that there's no dashes.
I know you're the director of product design, Kevin. That's actually the exclude function, not the exclude command, but keep going.
Thank you, Dan, for clarifying that.
You're welcome.
So now I'm going to go back. I'm going to use the employee master file as our primary table. I'm going to do a data join. Our primary key is going to be our clean social security number with no dashes. I'm going to choose the Deaf Master List as our secondary table, join it with the social security number, and I'm just going to grab a few. Actually, let's just add all the fields.
Sure.
From our employee master table, and let's call this the dead person list. Seems like an appropriate name. And ACL is just going to auto harmonize the fields in case the lengths are the same or the types aren't the same. We'll just give it a few seconds, and shabam. Not that I doctored the data so that we would get a match or anything.
Right.
But from my sample data, we found Flynn Smith, who matched with the Deaf Master List, who might be working at our company, our fake fictional sample data company, under false pretenses.
Yeah. And so, again, this could be that senior executive that was hiding their identity, or it could just be a totally fake ghost employee that somewhere in there is address that paychecks are going to that address every pay run.
Yeah, this is another scheme that internal people can set up. If you have access to enter fake employees and pay fake employees, you could be setting up what's commonly referred to as a ghost employee and paying them and sending the payments to your address or your bank account.
And so this was a really simple example, Kevin. You cleaned up that field a bit, join, boom, here's the matches. At the risk of, no marketing here, but at the risk of sounding like a shill for ACL, I think your point about do it in your favorite analytics tool, that's easy to do in lots of tools. Where this gets more complex is where the type of data analytics matter. So in my case, when we were talking about the beneficiaries, we found social security number only works so well. Everybody knows that that's a unique identifier, and if they are actually a fraudster, they can be careful about how they use that.
But also the social security number could be of someone who's deceased, but they're not on the death master list.
Right.
So if the federal government didn't find out that person died, they might not have ended up on that list.
Right. Well, exactly. And so no matter the source of data you're using it from, when we had done it with beneficiaries, for example, we found different combinations of multi-matching kind of joins. So where, for example, instead of just doing social security number, we could say, hey, let's do a fuzzy match on the name so that Jonathan Smith and John Smith get recognized together, but then a literal match on their birthday and their gender or whatever the case may be. Those kinds of multi-matching joins, but especially powerful, in my opinion, especially as you want to adjust how many hits you get for how much risk is in there. Fuzzy matching, particularly where you can adjust how fuzzy the fuzzy match is, becomes really, really powerful.
Right.
And I think that's where the real magic happens. Like, most companies need to do what you just did. I think when you get into more of these cases, like the beneficiary payments, or like where we have hundreds of thousands of employees, these types of things where the risk increases, I think those kinds of matching techniques become increasingly important.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want to say thanks for everyone for watching today. Hope you found the episode useful and good, and we will see you next time.
Good luck finding dead people.